Cool. So I'll get us started here. Thanks again, everybody, for your time. I see some reaction thumbs ups already. That's good. I can wait for the data to do double thumbs up. We are a broad team of interdisciplinary researchers at the University of Oregon with many partnerships across the Northwest and other regions. Today, we have four presenters talking about Highbanks as an experimental management for carbon sequestration project. It's a project that began through a partnership between eWeb and our lab and has grown in a variety of ways, and it's a pleasure to be here and share a little bit of the project with you all. So my plan outline for this, I'll do a brief intro and I'll pass it on to Emily to talk about how the project begun, the whole setup, the experimental setting we have going on. Then we have Holly come and talk about plant restoration, vegetation cover, carbon sequestration in plants, all the way from Highbanks, as well as our more regional efforts in that direction with riparian restoration. And finally, we're going to close with Courtney talking about soil carbon sequestration, some specific mechanisms related to the different kinds of restoration projects we are involved in. I will say at the outset here that our lab attempts to bridge some basic science with very applied decision-making tools. If you want to stick around, if you have questions, please take notes. We can go back to either science or science or policy implication related questions towards the end. I will begin by sharing some bad news. Can you go through the slides there, Emily, please, if you could click.
Oh, not moving. Let's try again. There we go.
There you go. Yeah. Not to to repeat what we all know, but there are reasons for pessimism right there when it comes to the world of climate change mitigation and adaptation, the world of carbon sequestration in particular. Among the many reasons for pessimism, the chief three ones, as I see it, that carbon emissions continue to rise, and so does the Earth's temperature. Top-down policies, I'm talking about global agreements like those made in the climate conferences. They have missed the targets. Carbon markets have underperformed. A common way to graph this problem you see here in this plot, which shows a number of climate conferences globally, the most recent of which was COP30 in my home country of Brazil. And at each of these meetings, folks come together, make big policy agreements. There's some progress made. We advance some of what you understand and share language, but bottom line is emissions continue to rise, temperatures continue to rise as well. So there's a lot of lost hope out there right now. Next slide, please. But I also want to say that there are reasons for optimism, and projects like this, I think, embody reasons for optimism. The main one, chief on my mind, is the idea that even though top-down policies have missed the mark, bottom-up coordination, and by that I mean collaboration between communities, in this case utilities, research partners, and the more broadly the folks who live and depend on ecosystems, bottom-up coordination for conservation, restoration of ecosystems, carbon, water, biodiversity conservation can really spread collective action in a way that could really make a dent on the climate problem. One way to illustrate that is if you look at the IPCC models, the most recent ones on the climate change mitigation report published 2022. I'm assuming many of you are familiar with this, but what you're looking at here in this graph are many possible futures for Earth's average temperature. So you're looking at the categories here, C1 through C8, are the different possible futures, different categories that we are likely to experience globally, depending on how much you continue to emit and crucially how much we manage to restore in terms of carbon sinks. A lot of it in terrestrial ecosystems, as we'll be talking about here today. So the punchline here for me is that the difference between potentially catastrophic categories like C6 through C8 and much more sustainable futures like C1 through C5. The main key difference here has to do with the way we deal with natural processes, natural climate solutions, some of which we'll be talking about today. One more slide, please. Okay, here I have a busy sciencey slide for you. Okay, I encourage you to not to be intimidated by this. You know, most of this process is related here. You know, these are the well-known Earth's thermostat. You know, processes that since the beginning of life on Earth have led to more stable climate over time. The two key ones to keep in mind here as you go through the presentation on the left-hand side of this slide are the more commonly discussed organic carbon sinks. You know, through photosynthesis, atmospheric CO2 moves into organic carbon, and that can be accumulated in the biomass of ecosystems as well as below ground through soil formation, creating an ecosystem sink that can be long-lasting and become part of the long-term carbon cycle. And on the right hand of this, we have the other thermostat, the less discussed, but one that we also investigate, is the inorganic carbon sink or thermostat. You have the idea of the silicate weathering, reacting with CO2 in the atmosphere, forming carbonates and moving through the water column in the soil, then into waterways, into the long-term hydrological transport and sediment deposition in long-term carbon sinks. Could really, you know, if you can find a way to enhance both the left hand of this, talking about the blue arrows and the black arrows, and the right hand of this, that is organic on the left hand, inorganic on the right hand. If you can crank this up somehow through ecosystem restoration, conservation, and sustainable management, we have a chance of finding ourselves in a more sustainable future going forward. I wrote a whole paper on this in 2022 that kind of coincides with the beginning of this project. I'll leave the link here for you all if you're interested in reading more about this. But I want to pivot from this global, you know, big idea picture to more concrete on the ground kinds of activities that we can do to help not only mitigate the climate problem, but also, you know, improve livelihoods and the conditions for folks close to ecosystems here in our region. So I'll ask Emily to jump in and tell us a little bit more about the beginning of the project, experimental setup, and things we measure and how we measured. In the first example, that is focused on the organic thermostat. And we're going to have a second example on the inorganic later on. Thank you.
All right, I am going to talk a little bit about the historical land use of Highbanks and our survey design. We began our partnership with eWeb in 2019 when eWeb facilitated our involvement in a reforestation laboratory. The site, formerly owned by Weyerhaeuser, is situated on the south side of the McKenzie River and Cedar Creek. It houses the Thurston substation. And historically, we believe this site to have been predominantly dominated by hardwood riparian community. For 100 years or so, it was home to a small orchard and was utilized for grazing for a number of years. Prior to restoration, our team conducted thorough site surveys, and those surveys included FIA plot surveys. We established photo monitoring points. We did biodiversity studies, measured soil pH, soil carbon, soil nitrogen. We used bulk density to determine existing stocks of carbon, did some mycorrhizal soil sampling, and poured cottonwoods in the floodplain. We have a rather complicated experimental design. As you can see on the left-hand side here, we have phase 1 planted in 2021, phase 2 planted in 2022, and phase 3 planted in 2023. Each phase consists of a matrix of 30 by 30 meter plots, and these plots are replicated to include hardwood only, conifer only, mixed tree, no shrubs, and high and low density communities. These densities range from 600 to about 1,000 trees per hectare, and shrubs are at densities of about 13 to 2,100. We implemented these designs to answer the following questions, which are: what mix of hardwoods and conifers sequester the most resilient carbon? How does initial planting density affect a forest's long-term carbon drawdown capabilities? How do plant microbe relationships alter soil carbon sequestration? And also, can we apply locally sourced amendments to increase biotic and abiotic carbon capture? Experimental design aside, I must express gratitude to Matt Fehrenbacher, and he's with Trout Mountain Forestry, also Franco Restoration, and their planting crews for being boots on the ground. They did a really amazing job helping us plant about 16,000 trees and roughly 40,000 shrubs on the site. It was not a small effort to follow our complicated planting schemes and make sure plants were in the right place and in the right densities. We couldn't have done the work without them. And of course, we can't talk about restoration without talking about the challenges that are associated with that, such as weather, bioturbation, predation, and plant competition. So we did our best to ensure survival. We used mechanical maintenance, physical protection, herbicide applications. We removed invasives with the help of local Northwest Youth Corps and the Coast Willamette Watershed Youth Conservation Crew. ODF&W also came out and installed some raptor perches and owl boxes last year to encourage that raptor predation upon our rodents that are pervasive. We'll talk a little bit more about this with Holly as she talks about ELP's role, the Environmental Leadership Program. So Holly Amer, who, as she said, was a former grad student, has spent a lot of time thinking about riparian systems in Oregon. And I'll let her move on from here.
Thank you for that introduction. Yeah, so as Emily mentioned, I've spent a lot of time in riparian reforestation projects. For my master's research, I partnered with the SPA Lab and the Nature Conservancy to work on a project quantifying both above and below ground carbon in riparian restorations. This resulted in our paper, which is titled Restoration of Riparian Forest Cover Increases Carbon Stocks in the Pacific Northwest. So for this study, on the right, we have a map of all the different sampling sites we went to. These plantings ranged from about 5 years old to 27 years old. So we were able to visit a lot of amazing riparian restoration sites across the western side of the state. And if you go to the next slide. So these are some of our results from that study. On the very left graph, it's showing the carbon across planting age for the tree species. And as you can see, we had an increase of carbon over time, but especially after that 10-year age period. So after 10 years, we saw a really quick increase in carbon, but it just took time for that carbon to be stored. And then on the right, we can see a graph showing the understory carbon stored over time. And what we saw here was that understory carbon stored in a much shorter time period than trees, and then it started to drop off as the plantings got older. So what that really meant was that if you wanted quick solutions to carbon storage, that you would want to plant a lot of shrubs. So then if we go to the next slide. And then finally, what we saw for underground carbon storage in the soil was that the top layer, the 0 to 15 centimeter layer, had the most carbon stored over time. But throughout all depths that we measured, we saw a really strong increase in carbon over time. And then, so that segues into the Environmental Leadership Program, or ELP, which is a class at the University of Oregon. This class is really unique as it gives students the opportunity to actually be a part of real research projects. And in both 2022 and 2024, both of the ELP groups actually did their projects at Highbanks. So in 2024, I was the graduate teaching assistant for the ELP group, and they had their project focused at Highbanks. And I was able to use the research that I had previously done to create a project for them to be able to study this riparian reforestation project. Another great thing about the ELP project is that they were able to gain a lot of skills that you can't get in a regular classroom setting, such as doing research methods, but also the deliverables that they were able to create. So I'll talk about that in the next slides. So just another thing for the study that I focused on, we were able to measure a lot of different variables at riparian reforestation plantings. So these are all of the variables that we measured across all of those plantings in Western Oregon. And we saw that a lot of these variables were really important to see how much above and below ground carbon storage there would be over time. Another variable that I measured specifically for my master's thesis was leaf area index. This used a camera with a fisheye lens pointed upwards towards the canopy to be able to get a really great picture of the canopy cover that can give us a lot of information about the structure of a forest. So on the left, you can see what one of those images looks like and how much data that you can get from an image like that. And on the right, it shows our camera setup within a riparian reforestation. So moving on to the ELP project and how I was able to use all of these methods that I had previously learned in my studies to be able to create a project for them where they could learn a lot of skills. For the ELP project at Highbanks, these are all of the different methods that they were able to do. They were able to measure soil pH, lysimeter pH. They were able to measure biomass of all of the trees and shrubs that were planted. They also conducted plant survival surveys. They also measured carbon nitrogen analysis for soil. And then finally, they took LAI pictures with hemispherical photography. So next, this shows some of the data and the results that the ELP group was able to get. This shows how valuable that data really is to real-world research. So on the left, we have a comparison of the 2022 ELP group's data for the tree survival at Highbanks, compared to the 2024 group. So as you can see, this is really important data showing us how the different tree species survived over time. And then on the right, we have the same thing just with shrub species, which just really tells us which tree and shrub species can do well in a riparian system like this. Another result that the ELP group was able to find was the amount of average biomass at Highbanks. On the left, we have a picture of some ELP students as they were measuring some biomass. And they took measurements in phase one, phase two, and phase three. So as we can see, phase one had the most biomass, and that made sense because that was the oldest planting. But yeah, this is just another example of some of the data that they were able to collect, which was really important for a site like this. So finally, I'll just go over some of the deliverables that the ELP group was able to produce. Once again, of course, in classroom settings, you do presentations and things, but you don't get to do them in a public setting. So one of the first things that they were able to do was present their research at the Undergraduate Research Symposium, which is a conference-like event held at the University of Oregon for undergraduate students. So they were able to perform their research there. They also held a public presentation for all of the ELP groups at the end of the term. So they also presented their research there along with other ELP teams. Next, they were able to learn skills like collaboratively writing a scientific paper, which they did with 11 students, which was an amazing piece of data for them to do. And they also created a scientific poster, which was a lot of skill, which was a skill that a lot of the students didn't already have. Finally, they were able to create a website where they were able to put a lot of information about their project, as well as pictures, information about Highbanks, and also their deliverables. And on the right here, I have a QR code if you are interested in checking out the website that they created. Great, and next I'll pass it off to my lab mate Courtney to talk about her research at Highbanks.
Thank you, Holly. So now I want to introduce you all to a project that I led at Highbanks, which examines that organic thermostat side of climate regulation that Lucas mentioned earlier. And so Highbanks is still a relatively young reforestation experiment, and increases in carbon storage at restoration or reforestation sites often takes 10 plus years to become apparent in bulk soil measurements, as you saw in Holly's paper there. So this study was tailored to attempt to capture recent changes in carbon cycling at the very young site. Next slide. And this study took place in phase 1, where saplings at the time of planting were just 3 years old and had been in the ground for 2 years. And as mentioned, oh, sorry, you can go back. The site was previously abandoned pasture for many years before the saplings were planted, and we utilized those areas with pasture grasses as a control group in order to test how different reforested tree species are affecting carbon cycling and storage. Next. So the 3 tree species included in this study were incense cedar, black cottonwood, and ponderosa pines. The pasture grasses here on the left have symbiotic relationships with arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. And if you're not very familiar with mycorrhizal fungi, I'll just mention a few important things. These fungi are incredibly helpful to plants' health and growth. They can increase water and nutrient availability for their plant partners. And mycorrhizal fungi basically act as a soil carbon pump, trading nutrients to plants in return for carbon that's sent into the soil through those fungal networks. And it's important to note that arbuscular mycorrhizal, AM, and ectomycorrhizal, EM fungi only pair up with certain species. So in the case of the trees planted at Highbanks, incense cedars pair with AM fungi, the same type that the pasture grasses there were already paired with. Cottonwoods can pair with both types, and ponderosa pines pair with the EM type. So setting up saplings for success may mean making sure their mycorrhizal partners are readily available in the soil. And from our first tree survivorship survey, we learned that ponderosa pines had the lowest survivorship in phase 1 compared to these other species. And we suspected this may have at least been in part because the soil wasn't as rich in their fungal partners as with those AM tree species. So that was part of the motivation for including this range of species in the study. Next. And in order to capture recent effects on carbon cycling, we specifically looked at soil aggregates instead of just bulk soil. So these are basically just, it's a fancy term for clumps of soil. They're glued together with decaying plant pieces, fungal hyphae, plant roots, and microbes. And these smaller aggregates continue to clump together, forming larger macro aggregates. And this is an important way that carbon becomes stored in soil. By clumping around decaying organic matter, aggregates essentially protect that carbon from further decomposition. And that's why other studies have found that over 90% of topsoil carbon is held within aggregates. And in this aggregate diagram, you'll see plant roots and fungal hyphae, the little white lines there. So mycorrhizal fungi in particular are really important for clumping and gluing these aggregates together. And because aggregates can form and stabilize in relatively short timescales, they're a really great candidate for capturing some of the recent carbon cycling effects of this reforestation. Next. So in the lab, we measured how stable or glued together soil aggregates were by putting them through this wet sieving machine. With that, we can measure how readily they fall apart into these increasingly small sizes to understand how well protected the soil carbon inside them is. Next slide. Thank you. So we found that aggregate stability did differ between the tree species. You can see aggregate stability here on the y-axis and the tree species in control pasture on the x. And we found that incense cedars and black cottonwoods at the site had more stable aggregates than both the control pasture and the ponderosa pines. And both of these tree species pair with that AM fungi, which would have been in supply for them when they were planted. Next. We also found that aggregates at the site did indeed hold over 90% of all the topsoil carbon. The total amount of carbon in bulk soil samples is on the y-axis, and our species on the x-axis again. And then those colors within each bar represent the portion of total bulk soil carbon that was held within each of the 4 aggregate size classes. So this basically shows that incense cedars with their AM fungal partners increase the total carbon amount in the soil around them relative to that of the control pasture. And they did this with the formation of larger, more stable aggregates shown in the darker gray color there. Next. And these findings highlight that different tree species at just 3 years of age are already affecting soil carbon cycling and storage differently. Incense cedars were kind of the star of the show when it comes to carbon in this case, with their mycorrhizal partners readily available due to the site's pasture history. After just 2 years in the ground, they're already influencing the formation of stable aggregates and protecting carbon for storage in the soil around them. However, the star of the show may change with time, and continued monitoring at the site will provide further insights to how reforestation affects carbon cycling over these longer time scales.
Great, thank you, Courtney. Wonderfully said, as always. I'm going to circle us back to thinking about natural climate solutions now and turning down that thermostat. And I'm going to talk about our inquiries into enhanced weathering, which is that inorganic thermostat. The lab started a basalt rock weathering experiment in the greenhouse in 2022 using some of the trees that we had also planted in phase 2 of the Highbanks project. Our initial short study results showed a significant increase in inorganic carbon in both low. So here we have low in the center and high on the right, and N reflects the no basalt application. And on the y-axis, we have the percent carbon change from baseline. The basic premise, oh, actually, I do want the last slide. The basic premise of enhanced weathering is that CO2 is absorbed in raindrops and it's transported to the soil where it interacts with the basalt and other elements in the soil, creating bonds that lock it into carbonates and bicarbonates. And given the right conditions, it can stay in this form in the soil or be transported through the water where it can possibly live for a time or for years in the ocean. Also, there's the possibility it can be respired back into the atmosphere as CO2. Our early experiments in both the greenhouse and in hazelnut orchards suggest that basalt rock dust applications can both increase inorganic soil carbon and alkalinity in the Willamette region. So a big challenge was taking this greenhouse project and applying it in the fields. You know, some things are set up, agricultural communities in the Willamette Valley already apply lime, and so spreading basalt rock dust using a tractor and spreader is not outside of the realm. We did preliminary soil sampling on our study site on the right, which included some of those AM and EM groups that Courtney was talking about. And on the far left of that colorful pixelated area, we have our row D, which is our control row. We installed lysimeters after basalt was applied at a rate of about 2.5 tons per acre. We planted trees and shrubs about 4 months after we laid down basalt, and continued to monitor water and soil and plant survival after applications. Year 1, results were not exactly what we expected. Little surprised, but that's science. Our no basalt in fact had more change from baseline than our basalt treated areas. And this was true for both our soil pore water and our soils. Trying to explain this, possibly hydrology on the site could explain these differences in organic carbon values. On the far right-hand side, we have a relative elevation map. The red is higher in elevation and less hydrologically connected, whereas the blue is low elevation and more connected. Our controls happen to be in that higher elevation, and so there was less soil water interaction, we suspect, than in our treatment area. So what did we learn? We learned that microtopography and hydrology matter a great deal in tracking inorganic carbon. We learned that our disturbed furrows, or otherwise known as the planting areas, we had our furrows and our alleys. Alleys were undisturbed grass areas that were maintained with mowing. Total soil carbon values increased from baseline in all of our planted treatments, regardless of basalt or no basalt treatment. So we do have questions that we'd like to carry forward from this. We want to know if we can increase application rates to see more significant inorganic soil storage, while also maintaining the feasibility of implementing it on working lands. We'd like to know what the inorganic threshold is for storage, and also we're interested in tracing the heavy metal movement through the soil, water, and vegetation of these sites. Our work has informed the next stage of research that has expanded to hazelnut orchards across the Willamette Valley. This project is in collaboration with the University of Oregon's Hallett Lab. And in addition to enhanced rock weathering, we're also integrating native and perennial cover crops to monitor the associated carbon, nutrient infiltration, and orchard health changes. We do expect to see a positive effect based on our early results in health. And with that little nut of knowledge, I probably should save time for questions, and I will offer the floor back to Lucas.
Thank you, everybody. I just want to say thanks and thank you for this amazing team I have to make for making us all look so good at the Spa Lab. It is a really real privilege to be working at a public institution with top-notch researchers. We have a public-facing mission, working with communities and trying to advance science that will also be useful for folks. I hope we showed some things here that help illustrate how we can do more than one thing at once. Sequestering carbon, also training folks, training people, preparing the next generation of interdisciplinary researchers to not only measure this stuff, but make sense of this data. We really appreciate the opportunity to share some of that with you, and look forward to the questions if you have any. Thank you.
Lucas, thank you very much for that you and your team for that presentation. That was wonderful. I'm really glad we recorded that. There's a couple things I'd like to go back and look at myself. We definitely have some good time, some time for questions. So excellent job on time management. John, I see your hand raised. Do you want to go first?
Thank you. Thank you, Lucas, and your team. I had the pleasure of getting a presentation from you at eWeb probably about 3 years ago when you were first starting to do your baseline measurements. So it's very exciting for me to see the progress that's being made. I'm encouraged by the research that's happening with this, and the possibility. When you first presented us at eWeb 3 years ago, you talked about the possibility of restoration being a way to actually use carbon credits, being able to monetize the credits and do two good things at once, saying, okay, well, you need to buy carbon credits, but that doesn't just mean planting a tree. It can be doing a diverse restoration project. So can you tell me how the progress on being able to scientifically say, yes, this does work and we can use it to monetize, and how the progress is going with that? Obviously, we're 3 years in. Probably for scientific data, you need to have a little bit more than that, but I'm very encouraged and thank you for the presentation.
Thank you, John, for the question. I do remember that presentation very well. So, it made me smile just thinking back and how much progress has been made, how many people have been trained. So I will answer your question in two ways. First, on the policy side, the concept of additionality is the key concept for carbon credits, right? So the idea is that you have to sequester carbon in addition to what otherwise would have been there anyway. So the baseline data we generated was actually the crucial way to show additions on top of what was. So, we have because of that baseline data of 3 years ago, we can now quantify what has been added on top. And as Holly and Courtney showed, there's a long tail where maximum accumulation happens after 10 years plus. That was shown by Holly in Holly's paper and other TNC partners with repair and restoration across the state, which begun at the Highbanks site. So our original, before the bigger grant, we had the partnership with UWeb. So we expect the carbon credits to be accessible beyond a certain age of maturity for trees. And in the case of the data set shown by Courtney, we can see that there's already more changes, or rather significant changes, happening not only above ground but also below ground. And right now, the methodologies used to account for carbon does not include this kind of approach. Does not consider soil largely. So we think we focus on the science, and we think with these examples we can help influence folks how to better quantify and measure these things going forward. So I think the goal still is to try and do these two things at once, as you said, and more. One of the things that we didn't have time to discuss is this idea of increasing canopy cover and conservation of protection of water, waterways, including mitigation of increasing heat stress, and temperature conservation is something that's not often discussed in the carbon credit world. My point is, it goes beyond the two good things you mentioned, John. You also have the idea of biodiversity protection and conservation and restoration, as well as protection of waterways and many other things. So sorry for the long-winded answer here, but I'm excited about this stuff. Thank you. Would anybody else like to add? Courtney, Emily, Holly? Sorry.
I could just add that we do expect to start resurveying year 8, so we can actually have some results by year 10. So it comes by very quickly.
It's amazing, right? When we first signed this 10-year agreement, I looked at it, 10 years, look at this. It's already, we're almost there, we're halfway, and I'm excited about the things we're learning, and there's always more. Thank you.
I had one question, just curiosity. Why was a black cottonwood included amongst the 4 varieties that you chose? Only because it has a relatively short life compared to the other particular trees you chose.
That's a good question, right? Emily may have more details on this. The combination of the decision tree, pun intended, that we used to select the species had to do with a combination of things, including the typical habitat, as well as availability of enough seedlings and saplings. You look at Emily's number; there's a very large numbers of trees were planted and so we were constrained by what could have been planted, but the cottonwoods as commonly occurring in that kind of ecosystem was kind of a go-to. We really wanted to include it there. Emily, would you like to expand on that?
Well, I would just, first thing that comes to mind is that even a short-lived or shorter-lived tree may have benefits to the soil and accumulation of carbon in the system that older trees may not. And I think we've planted 2021, so this was after Holiday Farm Fire, and we were pretty limited on what we kind of species we could integrate.
Okay, thank you.
Ellie?
Hi there. So I guess I'm curious about the basalt dust. So is this like a product that's created, or is it like a byproduct of existing mining stuff? Are there particular quarries that you guys are looking for, like a mineralogical, formula? Or yeah, I'm kind of fascinated with like the where this is all coming from. Because obviously with mining and crushing and hauling and dust, I mean, just as somebody who has to, you know, explain to people that not all dust has silica. I'm just very curious about this approach. So if you want to elaborate a little bit, I'd love to learn more.
Yeah, I'll be happy to. It's a fascinating thing. I'll say a few things about it. First thing that I think should be mentioned is the IPCC lists enhanced weathering as having potentially 2 orders of magnitude higher climate change mitigation potential than any other thing we can do in terms of organic carbon. So the potential is huge, but it's not well constrained, meaning people don't really know how much, even if everything weathers, how much ends up in long-term sink. So there are many uncertainties. So more research is needed on that. Second thing I'll say that this is the Highbanks project was the first experiment of its kind with basalt dust in our region that I'm aware of. There are others in other parts of the country. Cornell is leading a big one. Yale has a big one on the east side. But nobody has the kind of conditions we have here with the sourcing being so close, the footprint to acquiring this material being so low compared to other places, and also the right pH for the waterways to transport this stuff into the long-term sink in the ocean. As to how we source it, it is right now a mining byproduct on the east side. So we can actually buy, Emily, correct me if I'm wrong here, but you can buy some of this at Home Depot. You can go there and you find varieties there, and some particular brands and companies, they do some basic chemical characterization of that, but we have to do our own chemical characterization. And the final thing is that we began with this small pilot study that didn't really show what we expected because it's super mobile. It really moves quickly through the landscape, a lot faster than we thought. And still, we managed to get a USDA grant to test this at the watershed scale, really, with Willamette Valley. Many 20+ farms are expected to be applying this industrially. So it's a pretty big deal. There's nothing like it. And it began with a partnership, a fairly small educational thing. I'm sure Emily has other things to add to this.
Specifically, I don't have a direct addition, other than yes, it is from Madras, and there's still intensive, grinding processes that occur, but we're kind of like on the end of that where they've used basalt for paving roads and doing other activities, and then you have this kind of duff that's not as useful.
Just maybe one quick addition here. The idea is that it would, so there's an impact and of course a cost and a carbon footprint associated with this, right? But the idea is this would replace liming, or at least minimize the need for that. So it reduce the emission of liming from mining to application, and we replace with something that could also manage pH in that way. And final thing I'll say is that nothing is perfect and free of impact. The potentially largest impact that would hinder application at large scales for this, as identified by the IPCC and others, is the impact on air quality around the areas of application. Depending on conditions, stuff can really fly around quite a bit. So we are in conversations with partners, folks who study human health and air quality potential impacts. We're planning to write research grants that combine not only the application side, but the potential down effect of this. It shouldn't be problematic under certain conditions, but in others, it could be a big deal. Yeah.
Well, thank you. It's curious because, I went statewide going to different, when I worked for the Department of Geology and Mineral Industries and hundreds, right, of different quarries. And there's all different ranges of weathering. And there are quite a few that don't pass for spec and aggregate because they're decomposing. And I'm just curious if the decomposing basalt of a coarser grain application would be kind of an interesting experiment because then you wouldn't have the dust on the sides. But that's fascinating. So thank you guys very much.
No, the size is a big deal. It really changes the weathering rates drastically, as you probably know, right? So the dust is really what we want in terms of enhancing it. But I think there are further experiments to be made with coarser fractions as well. Thank you.
On the continuing vein that Kelly brought up, has there been any recording so far, or is it just too early in the process to detect any impact on pH at this time?
Yes, that's such a good question. That is probably the easiest way we can see that weathering happens. Because the bicarbonates are formed, and then you can see changing pH faster than we would have hoped. In fact, so almost immediately, you're talking about weeks. You can see it in pot experiments as well as in the field. In pot experiments, maybe correct me if I'm wrong here, team, but I think in a matter of days, you begin seeing some changes in pH that can last for a while. So yes, there is an increasing pH associated with the formation of those carbonates. But they don't stay there for a long time, so they move around, and that then goes back to some kind of baseline. But it could continuously apply potentially.
Are you comparing this perhaps to lime at
Yes.
all?
Yeah.
Okay.
Both on the cost side as well as on the other potential nutritional benefits or impacts. As Emily mentioned, there's a potential here of heavy metal, depending on the sourcing of this. There's a potential of adding heavy metals to your system. We don't think there will be any risk at this, based on what we know and the kinds of concentrations we're talking about, the kind of sourcing. That shouldn't be an issue, at least for the rates of application, but it's something we're also looking at. This bigger USDA grant includes things that microbial activity and composition. So we're looking at impact at manyfold of this type of application, and to be continued. The project just begun. Yeah.
We're a little bit over, but obviously there's some good questions. So we probably have time for one quick one. Going once, going twice. Well, then I'm going to take it then real quick. Oh, Neil, I saw you come off. Did you want to go ahead?
I just wanted to say briefly that was really interesting, and I very much enjoyed learning and hearing more about it, and I had the opportunity to be on the youth crew that did some of those surveys a few years ago, and so it's really exciting to hear about updates from this project. So thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Just one quick question. The micro habitats concept is really kind of fascinating. Maybe just kind of quickly, what kind of scale are you talking about there? And is it safe to make the assumption, or the jump to that, like, that there's varying impacts with floodplain plantings versus upland plantings? Is that kind of where that research is going?
I'll let Emily address this, but just one comment. We designed this to be 30 by 30 meter pixels intentionally, so that we could look at from Landsat, for example, and begin comparing plots at that scale. But then the application goes, furrow and alley and so on. So it varies drastically within plot and across plots. So it's Emily, could you expand on that a little bit? It doesn't respect the boundaries of our plots. I'll say that. So 30 meters is probably too many.
Definitely. Plot boundaries are not necessarily respected, but I think it does give us an opportunity to parse out some of those questions about the mycorrhizal communities and how well succession is happening in different interacting communities. Clearly, this isn't your normal, sloped reforestation. This is a very flat floodplain. I would say easier to manage because we can actually mow and kind of have a larger influence on how things are progressing. But I do think we'll, as we move forward, we will get to parse out some of those finer minutia.